Welcome, everyone, to the latest Detroit Lions Lone Wolves podcast. I am the Doc, John Macaroon. As we inch closer to the 2025 NFL Draft, we are literally about 10 days away from the Detroit Lions upgrading their roster, looking at draft prospects to help this football team, a 15-win team, try and get over the hump to advance further in the postseason. My goodness, it hits quick, Christian, right? You look at the Detroit Lions, and now the draft, an important part of their offseason, is upon us.
Yeah, and it's been exciting to follow along throughout the process. You're going through scouting reports of 300 some prospects. Like, the amount of work that goes into this time of year is incredible. But we're nearing the end now. The end is in sight. And in just, a couple weeks, we're going to be knowing who the Lions have brought in to help bolster their roster. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all plans out.
Yeah, you look at these analysts and they got to go through 300-400 prospects. You see some analysts who devote their whole year to gathering information and learning about these prospects. So now we get to put it all together, see who the Lions have been meeting with, and an interesting name popped up. You recognize that this football team has Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's making $30 million. You have Jameson Williams, who, if he has a decent season this year as the team's number 2, he's going to start to potentially look to command a long-term extension, whether it be with the Lions or a different football team. So Dan Campbell said that the team is looking to get younger behind Tim Patrick. You realize Allen Robinson's career coming to a close. Donovan Peoples-Jones didn't work out. So you have the news that Matthew Golden, the top Texas wideout, was in town to visit with the Lions for a pre-draft visit. So it's real intriguing, real interesting because of where he fits in with his size. You realize that, okay, Khalif Raymond is a player that maybe potentially is at the spot that he would potentially covet. So I'm curious, what's your reaction to hearing that Matthew Golden? I think it took some people a little bit by surprise to hear that he came to town and visited with the Lions.
Yeah, this is exciting. Matthew Golden, one of the top collegiate wide receivers, pretty much the consensus number 2 at this point behind Ted McMillan out of Arizona in terms of prospects in this year's draft at the position. And I think that when you look at the potential fit between Golden and the Lions, there's a lot to like. The big one, like you mentioned, is Jameson Williams. We're expecting the Lions will pick up his 5th-year option, so he'll be with the team at least for the next 2 seasons, or at least under contract. And I think after that, though, it becomes difficult because he is going to command a hefty contract extension. And because of that, you'd probably like to see the Lions bring in another talented wide receiver in this year's draft so that they at least have some insurance at this position if they're unable to retain Jameson Williams a year or 2 years from now. So Golden would be an ideal fit. He's got great speed. He's an excellent route runner. He doesn't have that dynamic size that when you look at the Lions, that's kind of the area of need, is a big X receiver with a big old sturdy frame and a large catch radius. But Golden is a savvy route runner. He's very fast, as evidenced by his 4.29 40 at the combine, and he's got really good hands. So I think that there's an avenue for him to be productive in a scheme like the Lions right away. And this is a name that I'm going to be keeping an eye on here when we get rolling with the draft.
Yeah. Where do you think he would slot in? Would he potentially be able to compete with Tim Patrick for the number 3 spot? Or would it be something where you realize he'd have to battle a little bit to get on the field his rookie season?
Well, I think he'd be a different type of wide receiver 3 just because Patrick does have that size, that big frame, and he's more of a prototypical X receiver. But Golden is a burner, and when the ball is in his hands, he can do big things. So I do think there would be a way for him to get out on the field. Like I said, it wouldn't look the same as a player like Tim Patrick, but he'd kind of redefine that wide receiver 3 role just because his skill set is a little bit different than Tim Patrick's. But I certainly think he's more than capable of going out there and playing right away.
Yeah, you look at the Lions, and that number 28 spot, Christian, is really unique. You look at that spot, it gives them really flexibility. They could move up based on their history. You've seen last year, they found a cornerback that they felt like could come in and develop in the scheme, and Terry Arnold was the selection. They moved up. They've been willing to move all over the draft in later rounds as well. But this year, I think that, as you started to read these prospects in the first round, what you see depth-wise on day 2, I do think there's opportunities for the Lions to move down if you want to add more capital in later rounds. I think there's an advantage to that, but it kind of has the sense that there has to be a player in the trenches that they find could be a very much a valuable asset for Dan Campbell and the coaching staff. So it tends me to believe that the team could target someone and maybe move up, even if it's just a couple spots. But what are your thoughts now when you look at where the Lions are at, the prospects that are available in that range? I do think that number 28 provides them a chance to get a player that could have immediate impact. I think that an edge rusher could compete with Davenport. I think an offensive lineman could come in and compete with Graham Glasgow. So there's opportunities there, but there's also value too in saying, well, maybe you can go up and get a higher caliber edge rusher if you find that that player is a fit. So do the Lions move up, move down, or when Thursday night comes, do you think they'll stay at number 28?
I think they're going to move up. That me personally, I think they're going to move up, whether it's 2 spots, 3 spots, 5 spots. I don't expect them to trade into the top half of the first round, but I would not be surprised if their guy is out there with 3, 5 picks out. They move up and just go get him. Brad Holmes kind of has that reputation. They did that last year with Terrion Arnold. They did a couple of years ago with Jameson Williams. They've moved around quite a bit in Brad Holmes' tenure as general manager, whether that's up, down. But I do think that they should go up. And I think that if you identify an offensive line prospect or an edge prospect, those two specifically, who can come in and help you right away, and they check every single box that you got, then the Lions should have no issue moving up to go get them. And I think that's something we've seen Brad Holmes do throughout his tenure, and that's something I think he should do again, whether it's, like you said, for an edge rusher, somebody, in my opinion, somebody who fits them like a Michael Williams, who's that kind of big physical run stuffer who can also get after the quarterback as well, or an offensive lineman like a Gray Zabel who can go out there and immediately compete to be a guard on the offensive line with the ability to maybe slide in at center if Frank Ragnow were to be dealing with an injury. So those two guys are kind of like my picks, my Lions guys right now, just because they seem to fit everything the Lions do from a schematic front and from a cultural front.
So you look at it, and yeah, there are a lot of good players in this draft. There are a lot of talent. You look at it and you say, my goodness, the team should get a player that could compete. Now, the question mark is, how aggressive do you want the Lions to be to move up? You look at the level of talent, and I think at 28, you could get a Gray Zabel, you could get a Donovan Ezuraku to be there. You could as well target, Derek Harmon, a defensive tackle. So there's a variety. You could even go wide receiver if Brad Holmes believes that there's a player worthy at 28. But if they do make the move to go up, how aggressive should they be? Would you be willing to, and we'll talk about it if the Lions need to throw in a player, would you be willing to throw in a first-round pick next year? Or would you say it has to be maybe you'd be willing to go day 2 pick? How aggressive should the Lions be to move up to get a player? And is there a player that you'd say, okay, yeah, I'd be willing to give up a first and a player to go up into maybe the 12, 13 range to go up there and get a good player?
I don't really have that conviction with many of the players in this year's draft when it comes to packaging first-round picks. And I think a reason why the Lions should hesitate to bring another first into the package is because when your team gets to be as expensive as this Lions team is going to be, you're going to need those first-round picks so that you can continue to replenish the talent on your roster, because let's face it, they're not going to be able to pay everybody. So while I think they should move up, I don't think they should be making moves into the top 15 and packaging first-round picks together, because you're going to need that pick if you're not able to pay somebody that you want to keep around. So I think that the ideal range for them is to go up 5 to 6 spots to get a guy who's kind of that fringe mid to late first type of player, like a Gray Zabel or a Michael Williams, who, depending on the outlet in the day, it feels like these guys are anywhere between top 15 to borderline fringe first round, potentially a candidate to fall out of the first. So my ideal range for the Lions is right like between 22 and 25, go up, and then you package your first round pick with either that compensatory pick in the 3rd round, or you package, a 4th for that pick and a 5th, and do like kind of that late round pick swap if you're the Lions. So I think that you shouldn't be too aggressive, because I think aggression can sometimes be misconstrued with desperation. And, you talk about the need for an edge rusher. I don't want the Lions to get desperate or feel like they have to be desperate, but I would like to see them show some aggression. So you kind of have to walk that line. I don't know if that's making sense, but that's kind of where I'm at. Go get your guy, but you don't have to go up 10, 15 spots, I don't think.
Understood. Do you think the Lions would be willing to part ways with a player? Alex Ancelotti's on the last year of a contract. Amik Robertson as well. Good players, but, potentially could be viewed as assets as well. And it's not a bad thing. You look at it, these players as assets that potentially you could use to potentially bolster the roster. And it would be a hit if you were to move on from Alex or Amik, but you could also say Hendon Hooker could be a player maybe with the Saints if, they feel like, hey, we want to take a chance on a developing quarterback based on the fact that Derek Carr is no longer there. Would you be willing to part ways with any single player to say, hey, if a team like the Saints or a team above the Lions says, hey, we want a player as well to move up in the draft? If you want the asset, then you got to give up a player. Is there a player that you would say, okay, if they ask for it, that you would say, okay, absolutely not, that's on the last year of a contract?
I think when you look at that conversation, I think Hendon Hooker's the easy answer, right? Because teams have needs at quarterbacks. He's kind of an unproven commodity with a lot of upside, I think, to go in there and at least compete for a starting job elsewhere. And when you look at the long-term future of the Lions and Jared Goff just now beginning the first of a 4-year contract extension that's going to pay him a ton of money, you start to think that the future for Hendon may not be in Detroit, especially when he's got this year and then one more on his rookie deal. So, yeah, I mean, if somebody calls and wants Hendon Hooker as part of a package to move up, then that's a decision the Lions are going to have to make. I don't think they trade Alex Anzalone or Amik Robertson just because of that such a big emphasis on culture in that organization. And I don't see the Lions making moves like that involve Alex Anzalone, who's been a defensive captain, or Meek Robertson, who fit in so seamlessly with the Lions organization. And as a result has kind of become, I wouldn't say like one of the foundational pieces, but he's somebody who fits really well. And it's clear he is well liked in the locker room and by the coaching staff. So, yeah, I think Hendon Hooker is the easy answer, and maybe somebody else that's kind of on the fringes. Like there's some offensive line value with the back end of that offensive line, guys like, Colby Sorsdahl, if he ever figures it out. And you start to look at kind of the margins of the roster, and you're not going to be able to keep everybody. So there are certainly trade candidates on the roster. I'm just not so certain that it happens. Although if it were, I think Hendon Hooker's at the top of that list.
So let's talk about some players that the Lions could target on day. Everybody's seen the mock drafts. We're going to have our last set next week in regards to who we think the Lions are going to draft early. But a lot of people want to know as well, day 2, day 3, who are some players that could be very intriguing for the Lions? Who's a late round pick on offense? A player that could help Jared Goff, new offensive coordinator, John Morton. When you look around and you say, all right, there's some prospects, maybe a wide receiver later on in the draft that could help, or a lineman, or a tight end. I think that, certain positions, I think really bode well. I think that the Lions are going to target, and most notably is tight end. I think that you want a nice blocking tight end to compete with Kenny Yeboah and Brock Wright for opportunities in the red zone, and as well to be a reliable blocker when you have two great running backs. But who's a late round pick on offense that people should pay attention to that the Lions could target on day 2 or day 3?
I'm going to give you 2 of them. And the first one I'm going to bring up is because you mentioned the tight end position. So I want to give you a candidate for that to keep an eye on. And that is Jackson Hawes, the tight end out of Georgia Tech. If you look at his statistical production, you're not going to be blown away, and that's okay. Like, very modest receiving production in college. But the thing about him that sets him apart is he seems to own blocking. Like, he loves to do it. He plays with a mean streak. You watch his tape. He has no trouble going after and hunting down a linebacker to help carve a run lane for the running back. And I think that's why his skill set translates to that fullback type of role that the Lions have traditionally asked their tight end 3 to fill. And so I think a player like that in the 5th or 6th round is somebody worth keeping an eye on just because of his physicality, his toughness, and his willingness to block. And then on the offensive line, I'll go with Willie Lampkin, who has kind of become a trendy name because of the way that he was described throughout the process. If you read the various scouting reports, the physical measurables are not going to wow you. He was not a scouting combine invite. But the thing about Lampkin that I really like is his toughness. And the fact that even though he is traditionally undersized for the position of interior offensive line, he is not going to let anybody push him around. He goes out there and plays so tough. He's got a great understanding of leverage in terms of getting underneath somebody. The low man always wins, as they say, and he does a great job paving run lanes. And I think he's somebody who could come right in and compete for a spot on the roster. And in a year where, they lost Kevin Zeitler, so there's an open spot, I'm not saying he's going to go win a starting job on day 1, but he's somebody worth keeping an eye on in training camp, and because he certainly has the tools to go out there and be an impact player, whether that's as a rotational offensive lineman, kind of a swing lineman who can be a backup, or somebody who can surprise you, and maybe by year 2, year 3, he's a starter. Who knows? But those are 2 names that I really like as late-round guys on offense.
All right, you look to the other side of the football, and you recently did a piece on linebacker Nick Martin. You look at
Yeah.
a potential now. You do have to think about the future with Alex Anzalone and his elevated age. Look, he's still very productive. I still think that he's got a year or two of productivity left with the Lions, but you could potentially look to the future. In regards to the linebacker spot, especially with Derek Barnes, Malcolm Rodriguez coming off of injury. You can definitely count on Jack Campbell, who has steadily improved his game in his second year. I think big things are expected out of Jack Campbell his third year. But there are some players, I think, depth-wise, and you see a class overall in regards to the edge rusher spot that the Lions may even be willing to bypass an edge rusher in the early parts of the draft in order to secure maybe a talented player later on. Where do you think if they look at day 2, day 3 picks, a late round pick on defense that could help the Detroit Lions?
Yeah, so there's a couple day 3 guys that are slated to go between the 4th and the 7th that I really like. The first one is Kansas cornerback Mello Dotson. He's had a ton of production with the ball in the air. He's a guy who was always a threat to take the ball away, and that's a skill that the Lions covet. And I know they made a bunch of moves to help stock up on depth and at the cornerback position specifically. But if you're looking for a young guy to take a chance on, Dotson is somebody who in the late rounds makes a lot of sense. I think David Walker, the edge rusher out of Central Arkansas, is somebody worth keeping an eye on. Very productive at the FCS level, but will that translate to the NFL? Who knows? I know Jalix Hunt was a guy that was kind of in a similar predicament as an FCS guy, was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, helped them win a Super Bowl. So I do think that Walker is somebody worth keeping an eye on as well. And then Nick Martin is just somebody who I am fascinated by the fit that he could have in Detroit. You mentioned him. I wrote a piece on him. Maybe he's a will linebacker. Maybe he's a Mike at the NFL level. Might not be that guy to go to right away. But, I mean, a lot of his just trajectory, he's so productive despite being a smaller linebacker. He had 140 combined tackles last year. He was on pace to do that and maybe more in 2024 before a knee injury ended his season after 5 games. So I think that Nick Martin, obviously David Walker, I mentioned him earlier, but Nick Martin is a guy worth keeping an eye on for the Lions just because he fits that mold of somebody who you can take a chance on. He has the production, and a lot of people are going to look at his size, speed, whatever, and just say no based on different tests or physical measurables. But the Lions do have a habit of digging deeper and finding guys who are just straight up productive football players who have great technique and do things the right way. I think Nick Martin's a candidate to be that guy for the Lions in 2025.
Now, a player I want to talk to you about that's real interesting because his injury kind of prevented many from scouting him his last season at Michigan, and that's cornerback Will Johnson. You saw what he was able to do for a national contending team, a team that eventually won the national title. And Michigan players have been very much a team that's been scouted by Brad Holmes, being that their university very close to Allen Park. Brad Holmes can get out there and scout, and especially with the schedule that they had, they faced Texas, Oregon, and they faced the Ducks team that was really national title contenders, Texas, like I said. So there's some opportunities to scout Michigan players, Josiah Stewart, Kenneth Grant, and then as well to see national highly ranked prospects. But you look at Will Johnson, and it kind of, look, you don't want to say he went into business for himself, but for whatever reason, his injury did lag throughout the entire 2024 season. You didn't get a chance to see the full capabilities. And then his workout still hasn't done a 40. Many draft analysts say, look, he's got NFL speed, but he's not going to go put it on tape, his 40-yard dash. But you see that he's going to, early this week, he's going to work out for probably all the NFL teams at a centralized location, and he'll get a chance to showcase his skills. What do you think about Will Johnson, the cornerback? Could he be a fit if the Lions were to come knocking for his services? Do you think he's going to project well to be a pro from what you're reading?
You know, he's interesting. Will Johnson is very, very, very interesting, almost polarizing because he did have a really good sophomore year for the Wolverines the year they won the national title. But then this past year, it was just like he would just have weird like blips in coverage where he's getting beat. And I mean, you would just turn on the tape and you watch him a little bit and you'd see the wow factor. Don't get me wrong. Like the pick 6 against Fresno. I believe he had a pick 6 against USC or had a big play in that game. And you're just like, wow, like this is the star power. This is the guy that everybody thinks is going to be a top 10 pick. But then he's also like getting toasted in coverage. And so there's things that would just make it, and like, am I watching the same player? Like that's the kind of stuff that I would come away watching when I would watch Will Johnson, then obviously the injury happened, and he was kind of, obviously that just lingered and lingered and didn't go away. So he is one of the more polarizing guys. And I do think that the upside with Will Johnson is like that elite corner, that shutdown guy. And at his best, he is no doubt a top 10 pick. But does he have enough in the tank? And is the injury playing a factor in this? Like, is the injury worse than we've learned about, or is there something that's nagging at him that is preventing him from being at his best? So I do think Will Johnson is going to be off the board by the Lions pick at 28. I think that somewhere in that 15 to 20 range, somebody's going to see him available and bet on him. And they should, because like I said, at his best, he is very, very talented. And I would like to see that happen, as a local guy from Michigan. So, hopefully it all pans out for Will Johnson. I do think that there's high upside there, but just kind of an odd 2024 year. And hopefully we can look back on that at some point in the future and just say it was a misnomer, because, he's got all the talent necessary to be a star in the NFL. There's just some things holding him back right now.
All right, yes or no? If the Lions call his name, you think he'll be an asset for the Lions organization?
Yeah, I mean, they've stacked up on the cornerback depth, like I mentioned, and so I personally think that's a position they would go to later in the draft. But I mean, if he's sitting there, and the Lions have always said it, they're going to take the best football players, and because of that, I wouldn't be surprised, if it's a guy like Will Johnson. He's a very rangy, athletic, fluid. He's got good top speed on there, and we've seen that when he intercepts the ball and runs it 80-something yards for a touchdown against Fresno in week 1. Really good instincts, and he doesn't seem like he's afraid to tackle and mix it up. So I would be intrigued by the fit. I do think that there's a lot to like about his potential fit in Detroit. I'm not sure if that's where the Lions should push all their assets in the first round. I think that, we've kind of identified their positions of need, but at the same time, Brad Holmes is known for throwing curveballs every once in a while.
Yeah, real interesting couple topics we'll have here to close out the Lone Wolves podcast. Jameson Williams had some fun at a recent appearance with Jordan Addison, but it led to really an interesting debate, because clearly Justin Jefferson is among the elite wide receivers in the National Football League. He's top number 1, 2 in the entire league. But behind him, maybe not enough depth. Jordan Addison emerging. You realize that the Vikings, core of wide receivers are okay, but you look at it as you stack them against the Lions. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, clearly Jameson with the deep threat option, the speed, the emergence. I think Tim Patrick, a veteran, gives the Lions a slight edge. But I thought it was great that, the question was asked to Jordan Addison, hey, which group, the Lions or the Vikings, have the better receiving core? Make your case for the Lions, but could you see those that say, well, Justin Jefferson is better than any player that the Lions have as a wide receiver? But I think collectively the Lions as a whole, and if you add someone in the draft, I think the Lions potentially do have the best wide receiving unit in the at least in the NFC North.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of depth that the Lions could come away from this draft with. I mean, you talk about their top 3, St. Brown, J-Mo, Tim Patrick, and then Khalif Raymond, really, because he seems very reliable whenever he's called upon. He's not going to be a guy that gets 100 targets, but he's going to be somebody who catches 2/3 of the balls thrown his way and makes big plays. So I think if the Lions add talent in the draft, there's a legitimate conversation to be had here. Obviously, Justin Jefferson's one of the best in the league. Jordan Addison, one of the better young receivers in the league. But I think, pound for pound, when you match it up, the Lions are one really solid piece away from having one of the best young receiving cores in the entire league. I mean, it's not, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins at the top of the depth chart, but when Jameson Williams at his best, he's a 1,000-yard receiver. Like, we can't discount that, and because of that, I think the Lions should have a case for being one of the best young wide receiving cores in the league. And Tim Patrick, obviously, a little bit on the older side of things, but he was a great complement to those two. Khalif Raymond, very capable whenever he's called upon. And then you look at the draft, there are so many options for just young, talented guys who maybe aren't the best at everything, but they've got 1 or 2 defining traits, and that can help push them with some development into being a reliable contributor very early in their young careers. So, yeah, I think the Lions should target a wide receiver, and I think by doing so, especially if it's in the earlier rounds, day 1 or 2, then you're talking about a really, really, really good young wide receiving core.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's interesting to look at too, because Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, still has room to grow as a deep threat option. I think that as a player, I know that, he's never going to be satisfied. So to see what the Lions are capable of, and I think Tim Patrick, another year in the system, I think will be very much a player that you can count on. What are you counting on from Tim Patrick when you look at what the Lions can do at wide receiver? What do you expect from him? Tim Patrick coming in now, healthy. I think he can be a good third down receiver very much. I think even can be used a little bit more in the intermediate passing game with John Morton.
Yeah, I think that Tim Patrick is kind of that supplementary piece for that wide receiving core. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown is your go-to guy. Jameson Williams has the breakaway speed, and then Tim Patrick is there to do the little things. I mean, you're talking about a guy that can help you move the chains on 3rd and 8 when all the attention's on Amon-Ra St. Brown out of the slot, or when they're playing too high to try to take away Jameson Williams' deep threat ability. That's where Tim Patrick thrives. He's not going to burn you with speed. That's okay. He's got reliable hands. He can make plays with the ball in space, and he's never going to let you down, I think is the best way to describe it. Tim Patrick is never going to let you down. He's got really good hands. And that Green Bay game, I always go back to that Green Bay game at home when he caught 2 touchdown passes. Like that, to me, was the prototypical Tim Patrick game. Does not have the eye-popping stats. He may not be a guy that gets you 100 yards receiving in a game, but he's going to get you a 3rd and 12 conversion. He's going to be a guy you can look to on 4th and goal from the 7-yard line. He's going to be a guy that when all of your options are gone, he's going to find a spot to sit down against zone coverage, get his hands up and catch the ball. So I think that Tim Patrick may not have eye-popping stats. Maybe it's 35 catches, 40 catches, but that's a guy who you can count on, and that's the best thing you can say about a veteran wide receiver.
Now, one last thought before we exit this week's edition. Maybe we'll come back with an interview with an NFL analyst later this week, but it all evolves around people's schedules and stuff like that. So stay tuned at Detroit Podcast as we give our schedule and as we book guests and their schedules become more open. We'll see when the next Lone Wolves podcast, but we'll be back for sure next Monday or Tuesday to preview in depth the Lions draft. But typically, Brad Holmes meets with the media before the draft, and he'll answer some questions regarding, if the team has gotten some question marks or calls about number 28, what's the market, what areas of need he's looking at, what the strength is of the first round. So he'll answer some questions this week, potentially ahead of the draft. So if you were able to ask Brad Holmes 1 or 2 questions, what do you want to know about from Detroit's general manager?
Yeah, who's he picking? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That would be funny if he just came out and said who they were picking. But I think the biggest thing that I want to know is how, like, he's explained it before in a little bit less depth than I would like, but I would love to hear his evaluation and expectations for players like Marcus Davenport and Mekhi Wingo. Like, how does he feel about the defensive line in the margins? Like, honestly, what is his honest expectation for Marcus Davenport? Where does he see this going if he stays healthy? If Mekhi Wingo's ready to go right away, how does he feel about him sliding in and playing a big role in the defensive line? Because if he doesn't feel good about that, then there's your answer about where they're looking in the draft. Because if he doesn't feel great about Davenport or about Wingo or about Broderick Martin, who he talked about at the league meetings, like, then you start to see these areas where they need help. That's where they would need help. And then obviously you want to know the long-term future of some of these guys, like a DJ Reader, who's coming into the last year of a 2-year deal. And you mentioned Amik Robertson and Alex Anzalone, both entering the final year of their respective contracts as well. So these veterans, in a situation where you have so many young players that you drafted that you need to pay, how do you feel about giving these veterans another contract? How do you feel about, I mean, I know Alex Anzalone, he's a leader, he's a defensive captain. I know how they feel about Anzalone, but this is also a business. How do they feel about giving him another contract when what he's worth may not line up with what they have to pay him? So this is becoming a fascinating offseason. And then the 2026 one is going to be the one where you have to make a bunch of tough decisions. So I'm really interested in where he thinks things stand with his veterans from a long-term perspective, and how that fits into their overall salary cap plans, because the money they have is not infinite and they're going to have to make some tough decisions.
No doubt. It's going to be interesting to see what comes about Brad Holmes' next media session that he addresses the draft. It's going to be interesting stuff, too, because it's getting closer. And it's very important draft for the Lions to be able to
Yeah.
upgrade the talent and build competition at a lot of spots. You're probably going to need depth at safety, linebacker, defensive tackle, and your high end spots probably in the trenches. So I can't wait to see the wheeling and dealing. 7 picks currently, but Brad Holmes is going to move all over the place. So look forward to next week as we break it all down in depthly. We'll have our final mock drafts. We'll give our reasons for the final mock drafts before we record the final podcast, and we'll give our explanations as to why, and we'll give our previews and our thoughts as to how each pick will break down. You can check out what the odds makers are saying, where each position could go with the Lions. Or, you have a lot of scouting reports. Make sure you visit Lions on SI consistently for daily analysis, videos, highlights, and breaking news regarding the Detroit Lions. And just a little side note here, as we were talking, Julian Aquara, the former Lion, ends up with the Browns. So he's still sticking around the league, bouncing around. So you hope that he continues to try to make waves and get a stronghold somewhere, as the former Notre Dame defensive lineman still tries to make noise in the league. Make sure you follow the network at Detroit Podcast. Follow us, Lions on SI as well. You can find all the news, all the information you need at Detroit Podcast. That's the hub of the operation, where you can find links to all the articles, podcasts, videos that we post as well. And if you have any questions, feel free, let us know, as we take questions and answer them and give you, the audience, the things that you're looking for in your Detroit Lions coverage. Thanks again, everybody. I look forward to firing it up next week, hopefully on the next episode of the Detroit Lions Lone Wolves podcast. All right. Now we survive.